Sup everybody, this is Karak with ACG, and as always it's my continuing mission to bring you reviews that aren't 2 minutes long or filled with sponsored bullcrap. And welcome to my review of Monster Hunter World for the Xbox, PS4, and later on the PC. So go ahead and sit on back and revel in the majesty of the Wild Kingdom as you get to take on the persona of a fantasy-based, mace-wielding Marlin Perkins trying to get back at nature for not paying his Mutual of Omaha premiums. Monster Hunter is out the 26th of January for $59.99, and thanks again to Capcom for supplying review codes so early, and of course, the open beta that many of us got to play. Let's do this. As always, if you like the video, maybe subscribe. So here's my review for Monster Hunter World. Hi, I'm wearing your head, the world's worst back knee, and the never-ending cycle of beast versus man with a gun sword. Graphics are up first. There is really no denying that at times Monster Hunter World is a looker, from the bleached out sun-dappled look of that first area to the allergy-stricken nightmare world of the coral levels, later on with almost Michael Bay levels of plant sperm floating throughout the air. It is carefully cultivated as a series of worlds, and while it's not open world, it's much like a large game hunter reserve, with each location riddled with cutbacks, shortcuts, little travel secrets, and the like. And I really did like the level design here. It's level design that's so important in games like this, where players are going to go from first-time experience to old-hand experience in many areas. Keeping things a bit mixed up is always going to help. I also think the color work really is impressive, from the glowing neck bulges of the fire-breathing enemies to the smaller raptor-sized creatures. All have this different look and color palette to them, depending on the sex of the creature in it, and it just works really well. Now, when it comes to the characters you can play and, of course, interact with, they're equally well thought out, with a somewhat robust character creator for you to generate your first hunter. There is indeed also a fantasy flair here, but it's more subdued than I actually expected, and the animations, when it comes to the 14 different weapons, are completely diverse. I mean, let's be honest, only 2 of these would even really be considered normal. The rest are crazy magical guns or monolithic blades that look like someone stripped the bumper off an old Buick and then sharpened it and called it good. Now, when it comes to animations and enemy designs, the game really is insanely well done, and it's the reading of the enemy's tells and the timing of your own that is so rock solid in Monster Hunter. You have to keep your eye open and really watch for what the enemies are doing, and that's telegraphed quite well, even if it's in short windows. The difference between, for example, a tail whip head bob and a creature rearing back with a size 60 foot with 12-inch claws on it can be deceptive at first, but trust me, the differences are there, with, of course, harder and harder enemies not having the expected just higher hit numbers, but also, of course, the tells in their movements or chained attacks being whittled down. But yes, as some have said, the HUD is a little bit busy, and just overall the game is. There's something to interact with or see or do at every moment you're running through it, and scout flies, which sort of are a glorified map arrow, can get in your way and even be a little bit confusing at particular times. But overall, the development team has worked hard on making sure that each element has its own discrete place on the screen. Now, while at a solid 1080p resolution on the normal consoles and on the PS4 Pro in the graphics and frame rate modes, the game also sees 4K checkerboard on Xbox X and PS4 Pro in resolution mode. But there's one thing that Monster Hunter really has an issue with, and that's the frame rate. On the frame rate mode, which is set to prioritize frame rates, thus the name, they are still unlocked. And if you're susceptible to noticing stutter from a game going from maybe 30 FPS to 45, that mode might actually be more troublesome than it's worth. At the same time, the other modes, even when dropping the resolution down to 1080p, don't really resolve into incredibly stable frame rates at all times either. We see some drops below 30 on the normal consoles, and even on the Pro we see a couple, but they're less noticeable. It's a little bit sad that none of the modes are perfect, and when it comes down to it, 4 fools have all brought hunting licenses for the world's most fashion-forward fruit bat. You also want that FPS to be as rock solid as possible, and it really isn't. But it's also doing a ton. There is a sense of grandeur here that's nailed. When massive creatures enter the same area and begin to battle it out, it's hard not to be impressed and feel like you have that Jurassic Park moment when the banner falls around the Tyrannosaurus's head, except this time there's 2, they're about 3 times bigger, and they also fly. That being said, the game is nowhere near perfect, and you can see a good amount of clipping when it comes to creature groups, and while animations for the creatures and the characters separate look very well done, anytime there's a lot of interaction with the landmass itself, there is some noticeable hangups. All that being said, the game is doing a tremendous amount with a lot of different things, and the design itself is absolutely incredible, from lush jungles to lava-spewing crags. Sound, music, and voice. And of course, we're going to do sound first. It's very well done, and the first thing you will notice, though there's not a bevy of audio options to choose from, is a good wide sound separation and 3D process if you choose the headphone option. And it's uncountable how many times I was saved by the fact that I could hear an enemy shaking his head preparing for attack just outside of the camera. It works really well. Weapons also have very good audio tells for hits, misses, and of course the big whiffs when your ancient wrecking ball strapped to an oak branch ends up missing a creature's head by 5 feet. Now, of special mention are the monsters themselves, though, and the various sounds that they make, from stunning roars to the heady wind of air screaming under the wings as they come in for a landing. It's incredibly well done, and it works to really affect the gameplay. For example, hearing an animal making hurt sounds prior to it running away can actually help you strategize that very next moment. Even if, yeah, it's actually a bit sad that the entire game is based around a bunch of people who said, look, there's an island filled with magical creatures, let's kill them all. Overall, though, great sound. And of course, that brings us to voice. And while some of the characters in the cutscenes do pretty well, for the most part, the game ends up doing the age-old adage of having someone utter one sentence and then having you skip through text to get to the rest of what you wanted in any particular location. The voices themselves, I would say, are fine, but they don't really do anything to elevate the experience. Music. This is actually very good, but it is also very repetitive. And while I love the Saurian themes during battles, and they have these heavy strings and woodwinds trying to fight it out to see who can get noticed first, and then you notice it fade back to this almost surreal nothingness that just shares a couple of the barest instruments between the two, in the end, it was fairly repetitive, and hearing the damn ditty being played in the city after the 50th hour made me want to die just a little bit inside. I would have really loved for far more fleshed out musical presentation when it comes to those locations that the game just knows you're going to be in a lot. And of course, that brings us to gameplay and a bit about the story. Now, as with other titles, you play as a hunter sent by the Research Commission to hunt down and capture monsters for later study, and that's about it. The story takes one tiny detour, but overall, it's pretty much just go here, study by smashing the brains in of assorted monsters and wildlife in those locations, and use that study to further upgrade and equip your characters. And make no mistake, that is vitally important because the world is freakishly dangerous. It's pretty much so dangerous chicks probably give birth at gun shops here. And speaking of guns, or in this case weapons, that's one of the first things you're going to have to come to grips with in Monster Hunter. There are no classes, just weapons, armor, charms to give you passive benefits, and mantles to give you the occasional special skill. Just sort of consider them magical cloaks. So once you get done with that character creator, the title just thrusts you in and you have to choose a different weapon to play with. Now, Monster Hunter plays about the same whether you're alone or with 4 people, but I'll cover that in a second. Now, if you go solo or with just one other person, you can take along your Palico, which is a mix of Pal and Calico Cat, and they are indeed cat companions that have their own set of armor and weapon upgrades, as well as some mini skills, and most importantly, can sometimes actually recruit creatures to fight on your side. This is one of the things I absolutely loved. Now, in the main city, you have a quest giver who can dole out different story, optional, investigative, and event missions, all of them giving you a target like taking down a monster or collecting one with nets or finding someone lost, and explains the possible creatures you're going to see and the reward for doing so. Or you can just go out into the wild in what's called an expedition, which really is usually the best way for learning about a location or testing out a weapon. And prior to doing that, you can of course take some bounties with you, which are up to 6 different little mini missions like collecting herbs and so forth. You can also sit down and have a bite at the unhygienic outdoor restaurant, which gives you various bonuses depending on the meal. And then you're off to the races. Battle appears at first really simple, with most weapons having basic combos and timing parameters, but it is actually quite complex. And while some of the attack patterns can be tested or are shown in the various tutorial movies, when out in the field, make sure you experiment, as most likely each weapon has something unique that isn't really covered in your initial time with it. Now, as I said, each weapon is different. There's the heavy knockout chance of the bigger weapons like the hammer, to the charge blade that builds up charge as you use it and then you transform it into a giant axe, or a sword and shield, which, unlike most weapons, allows you to actually heal with the weapon unsheathed. And that's the thing, other than the sword and shield, the game's really about understanding when to sheathe the weapon. It's unique to have a game not only about timing attacks and defenses, but also timing that kind of downtime. Other than a couple other titles, we rarely see an emphasis on something like that. For instance, most weapons here are sheathed so you can use a bevy of other items that you brought into the field, like laying down traps, shooting enemies with various different items from your slingshot to bother, distract, or confuse them, to eating different items that can buff up your character, as well as sharpening any of the hand-to-hand weapons, because as you use them, they become unsharp and they do less damage. But it also leaves you completely at the mercy of the monster you most likely hit on the head 40 times just a second ago. And the best part about them is most of them can friggin' scoot across the level when it comes to different attacks. They have stuns, they have roars, they have swooping attacks to leaps that churn up the ground in front of them for hundreds of feet. Now, you can also switch out to heavy or light guns or the bow as one of your 14 weapons and take out enemies from a distance, as well as outfitting yourself with various elements and special damage ammo. The entire game really is predicated on a monster's movement, with the heavier weapons really requiring you to wait past an opening that won't do as much damage to an enemy in a smaller window that will do more, and that is something that it takes a while to get used to. Add to that each monster has a weak spot, and the fact that a large number of items in the game world can be interacted with while in battle, like healing bugs or bugs that flash and blind monsters for a moment. And you have this strange tapestry of enemy, environment, and education. As you play, you gain data about the monsters, and trust me, the first time you fight some of these, you're going to think, you know what, I know that dodging to the right or left works, and then suddenly another monster shows up, and now you have these two pissed off primordial heads who are trying to smash you into the ground hard enough to see if you could pipe out oil. But of course, winning's the important part, and whenever you do, you head back to camp, and that's where the gameplay loop of killing, collecting, and crafting really begins. Because as you take down the enemies, you start to learn how to whittle them down into armor and weapons, and that feedback mechanism is one of the highlights of Monster Hunter. At the armor, you can forge and upgrade weapons and armor, you can create charms, upgrade your palico, construct your bow gun, and add mods to it, and even raise and upgrade kinsects, which are insect-like elements to a particular weapon in the game that can attack enemies' weak points. It's also where I feel that fans are going to hit a bit of a speed bump, because the weapons are upgraded using items from the game world, and the armor's forged the same way, but armor's actually upgraded using a totally different armor point that you get from research and bounties. That doesn't really come across very well in the game. But armor's still useful, because each piece of armor will give you a set passive skill. Skills that have the ability to, say, shake off an enemy's wind attack faster or do more damage. It's that really step 1, 2, 3 of upgrading, though, that I think we might see some confusion from some people. There's just a massive amount of data to keep track of. Also, enemy kills rarely count for cross purposes, meaning if you go into an area to kill one monster and somehow defeat another, and there's a quest to defeat that creature, it's most likely not going to get counted because it's not the active quest. And I think it's important to understand that's a gameplay loop. That's by design, but I can see it disappointing some people to show up and say, hey, I just killed this creature, and they're like, yeah, not good enough. Lastly, a bit about the timers, because a lot of people talk about it. It is true. Most missions have timers of some kind. Run out and boom, your hunt is done. We could argue good and bad points to a system like this for days, but yes, they're there. They are also very long, 50 minutes for most, and usually that's more than enough time to go out and single-handedly devastate an entire family tree of creatures anyway. Now, when it comes to multiplayer, you can pretty much do everything that you can in the single player, and the beta showed that in online just worked incredibly well. But as with some things, we're just going to have to wait and see how it holds up to the huge number of folks who want to jump in. One thing I found was that I really couldn't get anybody to actually play online with me during this review phase. Now, to finish this up, I want to talk a bit about the arena, which I think is one of my favorite parts of the game. This is a place where you or some friends can take down specific creatures with specific weapon and armor sets in time frames that are tracked via leaderboards. This also gives you some fun rewards, and it offers the dual usefulness of allowing you to test out new weapons in battle conditions without all that rigmarole of setting it up. And of course, that brings us to fun factor. Monster Hunter is really fun. It is also complex and a bit cumbersome, and really it's far, far from perfect. And it's all those things. It's also repetitive in the same way that a Diablo or an MMO could be. So if you like those kind of games, you might like this. If you don't like that repetitiveness, if you don't like that loot, then you may not enjoy this game. And knowing that and going into it with your eyes open is the best way to play it. When Monster Hunter truly pays off, it's really using that loot system. It's incredibly rewarding, and all of the cycles and mechanisms and gameplay sort of feed into that. And the weapons are impressively diverse. And testing them out for the review was a blast, but you know, it can be frustrating at times for sure. The oddity of the inventory and the timers for some people are definitely going to set people off. It does feel at times that it has 1 foot in current game design and 1 foot in game design of about 10 years ago, and honestly, I suppose it probably does. So as you guys know, I rate games on a buy, wait for sale, rent, or never touch it again rating scale. The amount of time, the loot system, all that kind of stuff is impressive, so I will rate this as a buy, but I will say that there are a number of caveats. First of all, it is an MMO style game. It is repetitive like a Diablo, so if you don't like that, just don't even look at it, because that is what you're getting. I also feel that when it comes down to it, there was a bit of a bump at the starting, and I admit that the game didn't do as much as it really should have from the very get-go to bring in new people, and I think that that comes from a lot of times creators being a little too close to their product and not seeing the deficiencies there. Luckily, that initial curve smooths out, but even if just you do the main story and some of the side quests, you have an incredibly beefy game here. So that's it for me. I hope you liked the video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, give it a thumbs down, and make sure to check out Reddit or Twitter. And when it comes down to it, if you want to be a patron to help me continue to give you guys reviews that aren't 2 minutes long or filled with sponsored bullcrap, that is always appreciated. Peace out and enjoy the rest of your week.